Tom Sutcliffe will be here to start the week next after we hear from Ritula Shah about the world tonight. Hi, Ritula.
Hello, Ron. Tonight, a new post-Brexit deal for Northern Ireland. Rishi Sunak and the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen have reached an agreement which the Prime Minister says removes any sense of a border in the Irish Sea. We'll hear reaction to the deal from the Democratic Unionists, who've said they still have key areas of concern. Also, could Brexit really be done this time? Why has this negotiation appeared to be much smoother than the ones which preceded it? And as this is my last time presenting The World Tonight, we'll be looking back on how the world has changed over the past 15 years. Do join me on The World Tonight at 10.
Ritula, thanks very much. We look forward to it.
It's 10 o'clock. Good evening. This is The World Tonight with Ritula Shah. The UK and the European Union have agreed new post-Brexit trading rules for Northern Ireland, describing the deal as a new chapter in their relationship.
As a Conservative, a Brexiteer and a Unionist, I believe passionately, with my head and my heart, that this is the right way forward. Right for Northern Ireland, right for our United Kingdom, and I commend it to this House.
But the Democratic Unionists still have their doubts.
Can I understand why we don't have confidence in that and why we still fear that our position within the United Kingdom is not going to be restored by this agreement?
We assess concerns about the deal and ask how this negotiation may have been different from previous UK-EU talks. Also, we remember Lady Boothroyd, who's died at the age of 93.
Order. I really must seek a withdrawal from the honourable gentleman. Order about the use of the word falsehood.
And as I wrap up my time on The World Tonight, we look back on how the world has changed over the past 15 years. That's all after the BBC News read tonight by Chris Aldridge.
The UK and the European Union have announced changes to the arrangements governing post-Brexit trade in Northern Ireland. The protocol has been replaced by the Windsor Framework. Announcing the deal in the Berkshire town, the Prime Minister acknowledged both sides had had their differences in the past, but the agreement would end the uncertainty for the people of Northern Ireland. Here's our political correspondent, Jonathan Blake.
In Windsor, Rishi Sunak and the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen claimed their agreement was an historic breakthrough that marked a turning point for Northern Ireland and UK-EU relations. The Prime Minister said it would ensure smooth trade, using green and red lanes to separate goods staying in Northern Ireland with those destined for the Republic of Ireland. Sovereignty would be restored, he said, with the so-called Stormont Break, which could stop new EU laws applying in Northern Ireland. In the Commons, to cheers from Tory backbenchers, Mr Sunak said the deal achieved what many said couldn't be done. Where's Boris? Labour MPs jeered as the Prime Minister paid tribute to the work of his predecessors. Sir Keir Starmer said it was an imperfect compromise, but again pledged Labour's support. The former Prime Minister Theresa May urged all sides to back the deal. David Davis, once Brexit Secretary, called it a spectacular success. Some Conservatives were more circumspect. Marc Francois, chair of the Eurosceptic European Research Group, wanted reassurance there wouldn't be any nasty surprises in the text. The DUP leader, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, acknowledged progress had been made, but warned that key issues of concern remained.
The Northern Ireland Minister and former chair of the ERG, Steve Baker, explained why the emergency break clause was significant.
If sovereignty is the power to say no, as I think it often is, this is a terrific achievement. I'm delighted. As late as yesterday, I still thought I might have to resign. But this is in the end, the mechanism by which I'm sure I can back this wholeheartedly.
The Sinn Féin Vice President Michelle O'Neill said the deal needed to lead to a restoration of power sharing at Stormont.
All political parties need to be sitting around the executive table taking decisions that impact on people's lives. That's where we should be today. There shouldn't be any delays in that. We have a health service in crisis. We have public sector workers out on the picket line. Where we need to be is making politics work and standing up for the people that we represent collectively, and I think that's where all energies and efforts need to be now.
A minute's silence has been held in Parliament in memory of the first woman to be elected Commons Speaker, Baroness Boothroyd, who's died at the age of 93. The current Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, described her as one of a kind, while the former Prime Minister, Sir John Major, said she set a standard for all her successors. Our political correspondent, Helen Catch, reports.
Betty Boothroyd had been on the stage as a dancer, one of the famous Tiller Girls. She worked as a secretary to politicians before becoming a Labour MP in West Bromwich. In 1992, she became the first female speaker with a brisk, no-nonsense style that became internationally famous thanks to the broadcasting of Parliament. She chose not to wear the traditional speaker's wig, but upheld most Commons customs. Asked how she'd like to be addressed, she told MPs, "Call me Madam." After 8 years, she retired as an MP and later entered the Lords as Baroness Boothroyd, where she was a fierce opponent of plans to elect peers and a vocal critic of Brexit and, on occasion, Boris Johnson.
The budget carrier Wizz Air has announced it's suspending all flights to the Moldovan capital, Chisinau, because of safety concerns. Russian missiles aimed at Ukraine have entered Moldovan airspace this month. The airline said the safety of its passengers and crew was the number one priority. The suspension will come into force from March the 14th. An Israeli man has died of his wounds after being shot while driving in the occupied West Bank. Israel had deployed extra troops to the area after a Palestinian man was shot dead overnight during rioting by Israeli settlers. Buildings and cars belonging to Palestinians were set alight. The riot was in response to the killing yesterday of 2 Jewish brothers in the West Bank. A White House spokesperson, John Kirby, said there needed to be a de-escalation of tensions.
We condemn the violence, of course, in all its forms. We also fully agree with the statements from President Herzog and Prime Minister Netanyahu that citizens cannot take the law into their own hands. What happened was totally unacceptable, something that we've heard loud and clear from our Israeli partners.
Nigeria's 2 main opposition parties have alleged fraud in the country's tightly contested presidential election. Provisional results from nearly half of the 36 states suggest the governing party's candidate, Bola Tinubu, is in the lead. The fraud claims relate to a new electronic voting system. From Lagos, our correspondent Mayeni Jones reports.
Election results traditionally take days to be announced in Africa's most populous country. There had been hopes that a new electronic system would change this, but it seems to have backfired. Polling station agents should have uploaded their results onto the Electoral Commission's website straight after counting ended, but that didn't happen. Voters reported issues with the voting machines and poor connectivity. It took more than 24 hours for the first results to be announced, fueling speculation of foul play in a country with a history of vote buying and rigging. Now the opposition says it has evidence the machines malfunctioned in several states. The head of the Electoral Commission has denied this and stands by the results.
The Farming Minister Mark Spencer has asked supermarkets to re-examine how they purchase fruit and vegetables to avoid further salad shortages. Lidl, Asda, Morrisons and Aldi have all imposed customer purchase limits on tomatoes, cucumbers and peppers because of unseasonable weather in southern Europe and North Africa. Mr Spencer said he used a meeting with supermarkets to reiterate the need for longer-term solutions to avoid similar situations. The Michelin Guide has shocked the culinary world by removing a star from the Paris restaurant of Guy Savoy. The chef, who's frequently named the best in the world, had held 3-star status at Monet de Paris since 2002. Reasons behind the removal of stars are not made public and only communicated to the chefs involved.
Oh dear. Thank you, Chris. You're listening to The World Tonight with Ritula Shah. Brexit, the never-ending story, delivered something of a major plot twist today, which may also mark the beginning of a denouement. 3 years after our exit from the European Union, the UK and the EU have agreed the Windsor Framework, a new deal aimed at fixing the post-Brexit problems in Northern Ireland, which was announced by the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. At a joint press conference, they spoke warmly of a decisive breakthrough and the beginning of a new chapter. Later, speaking in the House of Commons, Rishi Sunak spoke of his belief that the new framework answered the needs and concerns of the people of Northern Ireland.
I would not be standing here today if I did not believe today's agreement marks a turning point for the people of Northern Ireland. It is clearly in the interests of the people and those of us who are passionate about the cause of unionism for power sharing to return. Of course, parties will want to consider the agreement in detail, a process that will need time and care. And there are, of course, many voices and perspectives within Northern Ireland, and it is a job of government to respect them all.
And in a measure of how the Windsor framework had changed the dynamic of the relationship with the EU, the Prime Minister said the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which would have allowed the UK government to unilaterally override parts of the original arrangements for Northern Ireland, would now be abandoned.
Because we have achieved a new negotiated agreement which preserves the balance of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, the original and sound justification legally for the bill has now fallen away. In other words, neither do we need the bill, and nor do we have a credible basis to pursue it. As such, we will no longer proceed with the bill, and the European Union will no longer proceed with their legal actions against the UK.
And in the past few minutes, President Biden's described the deal as an essential step to ensuring peace from the Good Friday Agreement is preserved. The original protocol was supposed to prevent the creation of a hard border on the island of Ireland, but it did so by essentially creating a border in the Irish Sea instead, something Northern Ireland's unionists rejected. I asked our political editor Chris Mason how this major obstacle has been overcome.
Well, in essence, we've seen something of a climb down from the European Union. They've been willing, Ritula, to be more flexible, frankly, than they were willing to be a few years ago. And the essence of trying to deal with that border issue, that border in the Irish Sea, as so many critics have described it, is to create what's known as a green lane, so that products that are moving from England, Scotland and Wales to Northern Ireland, i.e. within the UK, and staying in Northern Ireland, will be able to travel across that sea border, but not a national border, much, much more easily. And it'll only be products that are heading from Great Britain into the Republic of Ireland, i.e. the European Union, and potentially further on into other EU countries, that will go through what's known as a red lane and will be subject to checks. And as far as a fair number of critics in Northern Ireland are concerned, as far as the previous protocol is concerned, this is a big leap forward, because their concern was about creating what looked like a division, a border within the UK, as opposed to taking issue with the fact that a different country or a different bloc's rules would obviously be subject to different rules and therefore would be checked.
The other major bone of contention, though, was the role of the European Court of Justice, which has the final say on EU law and the single market. But it also had jurisdiction in Northern Ireland under the original protocol. Has that role actually been reduced?
The European Court of Justice remains, and that was something said explicitly by Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, at the news conference earlier on. There is an attempt to reassure that it won't be reached for any more necessarily than circumstances mean that it has to. But the bottom line is that the final court of the European Union, and therefore when there are issues around its single market, which Northern Ireland for good still remains a part of, the European Court of Justice is still there, and that will cause some anxiety for some sceptics, there is no doubt. The other element that I think is interesting, and that the real detail on that will be looked over in the coming days, is this idea of a Stormont break. In other words, finding and designing a mechanism to create some sort of democratic scrutiny within Northern Ireland for changing EU rules in the future, because the EU's rules will change and will therefore be imposed on Northern Ireland in the sectors of the economy that are subject to EU rules, what's known in the jargon, horrible jargon, as dynamic alignment. What the two sides have agreed on is this Stormont break, as they call it, which will allow in certain circumstances Northern Ireland's politicians to say, hang on, we're not very keen on this, for there to be potentially something of a pause or even a block. Now, the question will be, in what circumstances precisely can that be used in practice in the months and years ahead, and whether the barriers to making it happen are deemed to be too high or too low. But certainly the Prime Minister and the Commission President thought that that was a significant move forward. As I say, I think what's key now is giving those, again to use a horrible political phrase, stakeholders at the core of this, not least Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionists, a proper chance to read the legal text, to read the real detail as opposed to the rhetoric around all of this, and for them ultimately to decide whether it's something that they think washes or not.
Well, from what we've heard tonight, can Rishi Sunak be sure that he has the the support of the Democratic Unionists?
No, I don't think he can. I mean, there have been some Democratic Unionist MPs who've been explicitly critical. Now, the Democratic Unionists are themselves a broad church and contain a range of views, and the outlook expressed by Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, the party leader, was more subtle, was more nuanced. And that matters because while it would appear a good number of Conservative MPs have tonight sounded much, much more warm towards Rishi Sunak's deal than some might have imagined, the ultimate prize here is re-establishing devolved government in Northern Ireland. The Democratic Unionist Party walked away from it just over a year ago because of concerns about the protocol. Their willingness to buy that this package, this framework, is better than what went before is really key, because critics will say unless the Prime Minister can persuade the DUP to go back into power sharing, for all of the other positives that he and his team are pointing to tonight that this deal can deliver anyway, it'll have fallen at the biggest hurdle if devolved government doesn't return. So that remains the big prize, and we can't be certain how that'll turn out.
Chris Mason, our political editor. Well, let's hear from the Unionists now. Sammy Wilson is a DUP MP and the party's chief whip at Westminster. He joins me now. Good evening.
Good evening.
Sammy Wilson, there's been a warm welcome for today's deal from some once quite sceptical quarters. Where does the DUP stand tonight?
Well, first of all, we have said that we want to examine the legal text and examine it and get an analysis of it. On the face of it, the government has spun the framework in a very positive way, but when one looks at some of the, even on the political declaration side, without looking at the legal text, that there are many contradictions in it. The one thing which we do know, and the Prime Minister admitted this, it's also contained in the framework, the Windsor Framework document, is that EU law will continue to apply in Northern Ireland. And whilst the Prime Minister said 1,700 pages of EU law will no longer apply, there are hundreds of thousands of pages of law which will still apply, and in future new laws will apply. And indeed,
but there is this Stormont break, isn't there? There is a mechanism now. There is the Stormont break, a mechanism now for you to challenge new laws as they come into force.
No, we can highlight, first of all, the laws have to have a significant impact, and we don't know what that means. Don't forget, since Brexit and since the protocol came into being, we've had 670 new EU laws applying to Northern Ireland. Some of those only affect small changes initially, but then have a bigger impact as we see the way in which they work out. So the first thing is that we can only identify and object to certain laws. Secondly, there has to be a petition of concern. And thirdly, once that petition of concern has been registered and the law has been voted against, it is up to the UK government to decide whether in the joint committee it seeks to veto those laws. And it also states clearly that the EU would have then the right to retaliate. Now, I've got to say...
Well, you're clearly concerned then. You're clearly concerned about the new mechanism that's been put in place. How long is it going to take you to look over this document, and how strong are those concerns? Are you suggesting that the DUP may reject it?
Well, I'm saying that if you look at on the surface, the guarantees which are there aren't really guarantees, and even some of the statements we made about VAT rules now being able to apply across the whole of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland, if you read the legal text, if it affects competition with the EU, then the EU can intervene and indicate that the UK cannot impose or apply VAT changes to Northern Ireland. And even with the state aid rules, again, the legal text doesn't make it quite as clear as what is contained in the framework document. So,
how much pressure do you think the DUP is going to face in the next few weeks and months? President Biden, for instance, tonight has said, I hope, as we all do, that Northern Ireland's political institutions are soon back up and running. Those institutions embody the principle of devolved power sharing, representative government at the core of the Good Friday Agreement.
Well, I think that, first of all, President Biden, if more than anyone, should understand that people should not have things imposed on them if they don't have a say in them. After all, his own country originated because they refused to have taxation without representation, and Northern Ireland will still continue to have foreign law imposed on it without proper representation. And secondly, we don't really care what pressure is imposed on us. The future of our country within the United Kingdom is at stake, and therefore, if this document does not get that right and does not give a guarantee that we will remain fully part of the United Kingdom, then we will continue to oppose it.
Sammy Wilson, thank you very much indeed. Well, Ireland, which of course shares a land border with Northern Ireland and the UK, would like to get Brexit done, probably more than any other EU state. So what does the Irish government make of today's agreement? Peter Burke is the Minister for EU Affairs. He was very positive.
This is a very important agreement to provide stability and predictability for Northern Ireland, for the citizens of the North and indeed businesses. I think what really helped us over the last few weeks is the deal that was agreed between the UK and the EU on data sharing, because that allowed the EU 27 get a significant picture of the profile of goods entering in through Northern Ireland. And the more robust procedures you have, the more flexibility you can give because of the additional safeguards. So I really welcome the deal, and I hope it provides the pathway to get the Northern Ireland institutions back up and running and delivering for the citizens of Northern Ireland.
Peter Burke, the Irish Minister for EU Affairs. Lord Barwell, Gavin Barwell, was number 10 Chief of Staff under Theresa May as she tried to secure a Brexit deal. He's on the line now. Good evening.
Good evening.
Gavin Barwell, it's clear from what Sammy Wilson was saying that there are still possibly some major hurdles ahead. But watching today's press conference between Rishi Sunak and Ursula von der Leyen, the tone seemed very different. The body language seemed very different. What's changed, do you think?
I think Rishi Sunak has taken a much more constructive approach to his relationship with the EU, and that has borne fruit. There's a startling contrast between the way he has gone about this to the way that Boris Johnson went about it. And I think there's a very clear lesson for the Conservative Party, which is sort of playing hardball, going back on your word, having people think that you're not ultimately trustworthy doesn't get you anywhere in negotiations.
Or is there another way? Could you reframe that, though, by suggesting that playing hardball, by putting the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill through the Commons, actually the British government almost wore the EU down, and it's the EU, perhaps, that's moved rather more than the British government?
Well, the EU has moved, there's no doubt about that, but the compromises didn't come under Boris Johnson. The Protocol Bill, when it was introduced originally, wasn't the thing that led to the EU shifting its position. It's Rishi Sunak taking a completely different approach to Johnson that has delivered the compromises that we've seen today, compromises that I think he deserves huge credit for. And I hope, despite the rather worrying tone that Sammy Wilson just struck with you, I hope will ultimately lead to the restoration of devolved government in Northern Ireland.
Do you think the Conservative Party has changed? Clearly Boris Johnson's a very different character from Rishi Sunak, but Theresa May, she struggled to make progress.
So I think if you're comparing where Rishi's got to with Theresa, I think there are three big differences. The first is he's got a clear majority in Parliament. She didn't have that. And that really counted against her in the negotiations because the EU were sometimes in private explicit with us about that they weren't confident that if they gave her an extra compromise, it would actually get the deal over the line anyway, that she wouldn't have the numbers to get it through. So that, I think, makes a difference. And then I think there are two other more recent factors, one of which Peter Burke just identified for you. So I think the decision Rishi Sunak made to share the live customs data was absolutely critical because it gave the EU confidence that their own single market, that the risk to the single market from the movement of goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland was very, very low. And then I think that in addition to that, they've clearly seen the damage that has been done by this version of the protocol to the Northern Ireland peace process. And they shared with the British government a desire to try and come up with a compromise that might entice the DUP back into government. So I think those are the three key differences from the original negotiations, 3 or 4 years ago now.
How much danger is there ahead for Rishi Sunak if the DUP really are resistant? They clearly have very serious concerns. If they hold out, if this process is strung out, what does that mean for Rishi Sunak's leadership?
So I don't think it's a danger for Rishi Sunak. The danger to him would have come if large numbers of Conservative MPs weren't on side with what he's done. And I think the reaction you've seen today from the Conservative Parliamentary Party is pretty strong, actually pretty positive behind what he's achieved. But clearly, as Chris Mason was saying to you, one of the key things, I think Rishi has got two key objectives here. He wanted to improve our relationship with the EU, stabilise that, get that on better terms. He's achieved that. But he also wanted to get devolved government back in Northern Ireland. And if I have some sympathy with the DUP. I understand why they don't like Northern Ireland being treated differently. That's why I favoured a different version of Brexit that tried to treat the UK the same. But they're not going to get anything better than this. This is as good as it's going to get for them. And if they refuse still to go back into government, then I think politicians are going to have to think really hard about changing the arrangements that we have in place in Northern Ireland, because we cannot allow a situation where for years and years Northern Ireland doesn't have any functioning government.
But that's not a runner, is it? I mean, that would jeopardise the entire basis of the peace process.
Well, I've seen a number of people have already written articles suggesting that we might have to look at that, because what's the alternative? I mean, you either govern Northern Ireland from London, direct rule, which is going to have very damaging consequences, or you just allow a prolonged period where there is no government of Northern Ireland. That's not acceptable to allow that to happen.
And just finally, one other person who has been conspicuous in their absence in some ways today, Boris Johnson. If there is the support that you describe on the backbenches of the Conservative Party, is his comeback dead in the water?
Well, I would hope that wasn't something that was remotely being considered anyway, given all the issues that we're all very well aware of about his record when he was Prime Minister in the past. But I think what we've seen today should give Conservative MPs confidence in Rishi Sunak's leadership. He's understood the detail of this issue. He's taken a completely different approach, and it has paid dividends in terms of the agreement he's reached.
Gavin Barwell, Lord Barwell, thanks very much. The headlines so far in the world tonight: Eurosceptic Conservative MPs and Democratic Unionists are studying the detail of a new deal with the European Union governing post-Brexit trade in Northern Ireland. Down-to-earth, passionate and formidable, Betty Boothroyd, the first and only woman to serve as Speaker of the House of Commons from 1992 to 2000, has died at the age of 93. Here she is upbraiding the Conservative MP, Ian Duncan-Smith, who wanted to intervene in a Commons debate between the then Leader of the Opposition, Tony Blair, and the Prime Minister, John Major, in the run-up to the 1997 election.
Order. I've just made it clear to Mr. Duncan-Smith that the Leader of the Opposition is not giving way. And yet, since I made it clear, he has been on his feet 3 times, trying to intervene and to disrupt. Order! I have not finished as yet. The Leader of the Opposition has made it clear he's not giving way. It is the custom in this House, once that has been clearly stated, that honourable members do not go on pressurising.
Betty Boothroyd in full action there. Lord Blunkett, David Blunkett, was a Labour MP who went on to be Education Minister in the Labour landslide that followed the 1997 election. He's on the line. Lord Blunkett, Betty Boothroyd, something of a performer. She'd once been a Tiller girl, a professional dancer. Do you think that background, along with that extraordinary commitment to politics, serve her actually rather well as Speaker?
Very much so. She was a Yorkshire lass. She worked for another Yorkshire lass, Barbara Castle. I experienced the rough and the smooth end of Betty's tongue, both as a shadow cabinet minister between 92 and 97, and then in government until she stepped down. A very real, respected character. People have called her formidable. I would call her fierce, as well as fun and fair. And there's another character who's standing down tonight, who's been a great professional broadcaster, who's brought great pleasure to so many of us, both listeners and contributors. And we'd like to say thank you, Ritula, to you.
David Blunkett, thank you. But let's stay on Betty Boothroyd for a moment longer, if we may. What do you think? Did she change the nature of the role of the Speaker, do you think? And did she change the way the House of Commons operated?
Maybe not fashionable to say so, but I think she got away with things because she was a woman and because she was fearless. And she could actually put people in their place in a very strong, but I think often very fair way. And people understood and accepted that. And it was really a breath of fresh air from, gosh, I oughtn't to say this, the stuffed shirts of us men. in the past and did break the mould. And she was a mould breaker in all kinds of worlds. I mean, a tiller girl, a secretary at the roughest and most difficult times with Barbara Castle. Those who are too young to remember won't know that Barbara herself was formidable and fierce, just like Betty.
An extraordinary woman and, lovely to remember her on the day that she's died, aged 93. Well, David Blunkett, stay on the line, because as you've already intimated, this evening marks my final edition, Presenting the World Tonight. And I want you to be part of a conversation we'll have in just a moment about the events and the tumult that's marked the 15 or so years that I've been a regular presence at 10 o'clock on Radio 4. Here's an audio scroll through the years, beginning in 2008.
The bad times on Wall Street. Lehman Brothers files for bankruptcy as the latest and biggest victim.
And on today's World Have Your Say, we're going to talk about Greece. Because the Greeks have been told if they pass austerity measures next week...
The Arab Spring began in Tunisia, where demonstrations were sparked by the death of Mohamed Bouazizi.
It's a harrowing image splashed across many front pages in Europe. The tiny body of a Syrian toddler washed up on a Turkish beach as his family sought a new life in Europe.
If we had a case that we felt we could prosecute, and my experts felt we could prosecute against Harvey Weinstein, we would have.
We start now with some breaking news. Reports are coming in of an attack, or quite possibly several attacks, in Paris.
I've just received a call from Secretary Clinton. She congratulated us, it's about us, on our victory.
20 minutes to 5, we can now say the decision taken in 1975 by this country to join the common market has been reversed by this referendum to leave the EU. The British people have spoken, and the answer is we're out.
Good afternoon. This morning I went to Buckingham Palace, and I am forming a new government.
We should take comfort that while we may have more still to endure, better days will return. We will be with our friends again. We will be with our families again. We will meet again.
Taliban forces entered the heart of the Afghan capital, Kabul, today, the culmination of a...
This is no longer a climate conference. This is now a global North Greenwash Festival, a 2-week-long celebration of business as usual and blah, blah, blah.
This is BBC News. I'm Lise Doucette, live in Kiev. These are the headlines now in the UK and around the world. Russia has invaded Ukraine.
Well, how time flies. Joining me to discuss some of the dramatic shifts that have occurred since 2008 are David Blunkett, who has been a member of the House of Lords since 2015 and was a former cabinet minister under Tony Blair. Also Martin Wolf, chief economic commentator at the Financial Times, and Karen von Hippel, Director General of RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute think tank. Welcome to you all. We picked 2008 not only for mad, egotistical reasons on my part, but also because of two events that many people would argue still have resonance today. I'm going to begin with the more obvious one, Martin Wolf, and that's the financial crash. It felt like a crisis as we lived through it. But do you think that governments, including our own, actually grasped how far-reaching its effects might be?
No, I think the obvious truth is they didn't, and in a way they couldn't. It was obvious that it was a huge financial crisis, and I have to say they responded to the event with extraordinary force and vigour and prevented it from becoming another depression. What they didn't know, I think, was two things. First, that they were about to make a serious mistake by tightening fiscal policy too soon and too much.
What does that mean? What does that mean? They...
What it basically meant is that they cut spending dramatically. They also raised taxes, so they took a lot of the demand out of the economy that was needed to ensure a strong recovery. And that, I think, further aggravated the inevitable impact of the crisis on longer-term growth and productivity. And in pretty well every major developed country, subsequent growth after the crisis has never fully matched what it was before the crisis. And so this has been particularly severe in this country, but it's also true elsewhere. So it's turned out that the financial crisis was not just a huge financial crisis and a shock and indicator of what had gone wrong in the financial system, but it was also followed by, 15 years of rather weak performance.
David Blunkett, I wonder how much of that analysis you share, and do you agree that it's a failure which ultimately has perhaps undermined faith in governments and indeed in democracy?
Yes, the immediate reaction of the G20 in 2009 was very impressive. The austerity measures, I believe, led inexorably to a contribution towards Brexit, towards the rise of Boris Johnson, the freezing, as Martin was describing on Radio 4 earlier this morning, in the United States of living standards, had a major impact on the rise of Donald Trump. And taken together with Syria and people movements, migration, and the way in which that was seen and impacted across Europe, led to Brexit and to the consequences we've seen since. Obviously, the Ukraine and the incursion of Russia and the pandemic are two quite separate things, but you can see the interrelationship of those other events over the last 15 years.
Karen von Hippel, the other reason that 2008 really interests me, it's also the year that there was another fateful decision. Ukraine and Georgia were promised NATO membership. Russia invaded Georgia later that year. Lord Robertson, who was then Secretary-General of NATO, has written, it wasn't NATO's cleverest decision. Would you agree?
Can I join Lord Blunkett first and just say how sorry we all will be to lose your voice every evening, Ritula. It's a very interesting conversation. I think when you look back, you can often say that with benefit of hindsight, this is one of the first steps where we didn't push back on Russia. Then it was later in obviously when the Russians invaded Crimea, when they went into Syria in September 2015. And then, of course, more recently, the attacks in Ukraine. But I also agree with what the other two speakers were saying about that the financial crisis, along with the Iraq war, really did lead to the rise of populist leaders and publics that were no longer feeling that their governments were serving them.
How would you say that the security situation more generally has been transformed over that period? Clearly, our perception of Russia has changed dramatically, but you've also seen the rise of China.
Right. We are in a more multipolar world. It's not necessarily that the U.S. is weaker, but other countries are getting stronger. And smaller countries can also cause a lot more trouble than we might have thought in the past. You don't need necessarily nuclear weapons or tanks. They can help. But there are a lot of other ways to disrupt other countries, disrupt economies. We saw with the so-called Islamic State, a non-state organization, how much mayhem and fear they were able to cause just with a few attacks in different countries. And so we are dealing with a much more complex environment. There's no longer the two blocks that we had in the Cold War. At the moment, we have Russia and China forming a bloc. You have the West as another bloc, and then you have the so-called rest, in different points along that spectrum.
Martin Wolf, what do you make of this remodelling of the world and, in a sense, perhaps the slowness with which the United States, Europe, to some extent, have perhaps grasped that actually power may be shifting?
Well, I think it is always very difficult for hegemons to get used to the change in their position. And the rise of China in particular is obviously an enormous event. I would add that apart from the other economic event we just talked about, the financial crisis, there's one other consequence which links with this, which is very clearly an end to the period of rapid globalization, of integration of economies. That was replaced with a period of what some people call slowbalization, which is not advancing. But recently, we're seeing a real pressure to decouple in many different ways, in very complicated ways. Nobody knows how that will end. But this is a very powerful economic force which reinforces the growing mutual suspicion of the West on the one hand and China on the other. I think that's pretty well the biggest economic and political event of our current era.
David Blunkett, decoupling, growing mutual suspicion. What effect do you think that has on the health of democracy in general?
I think we're in a very dangerous place. I think that the understandable desire for food security, for technology security, and for personal security is leading us to look very inwardly, insularly, and the way in which we're dealing with China, I think, is frankly inept and very short-sighted. And we're taking our eye off the ball as well in terms of the positioning of major countries like India, which will have the largest population in the world very shortly.
What would be a better way, though, to handle China, do you think?
Well, we need a degree of sophistication which we haven't had in international, never mind domestic politics, for some considerable time. Clearly, you have to be tough where you need to be tough, but you have to also understand that your interests lie in getting some sort of understanding and rapprochement back, which we thought we'd got in terms of the World Trade Organization when you first started with this programme, Ritula. And unfortunately, we're going backwards. And I fear that leadership in the world is probably at its worst for a very long time. My only consolation to all those listening is if you take a look at the first half of the last century, you'll realise we can get out of this mess, and we can get out of it in a better state than by 1945.
Karen von Hippel, do you think there would be a better way to handle China? And are we the victims of poor leadership, or do we perhaps get the leaders we deserve?
Good question. I think that the U.S. Assumption about China, which other countries have, in a sense, followed, has been proven to be mistaken. And that really was since Nixon's trip decades ago, when we thought, well, the more we engage, the more they'll become like us, and they'll become democratic and respect human rights, etc. And of course, that hasn't happened. And so we do need a more nuanced relationship with China, and one that works. I don't think that the U.S. Making these quite aggressive statements towards China helps, because it just makes China feel pushed more in a corner, turning more to Russia. But at the same time, I don't think we've ever really figured out how to deal with Russia either. I mean, we've tried with both of these countries, soft approaches, hard approaches, behind the scenes approaches, overt approaches, and none of them have worked. So I agree with Lord Blunkett. We do need a more nuanced policy on China. I'm not entirely sure what it looks like, and I'm not sure how easy it is to explain not only to the Chinese, but also to domestic populations, many of which, U.S. here and elsewhere, often want their political leaders to be very tough on China and use China as a rod to beat the political opposition.
Martin Wolf, the China question. Karen von Hippel was describing the new division in the world, where you get sort of Russia and China on one side, Europe and the US on the other, with a few other democratic allies in the form of perhaps Australia and Japan, and then the global south choosing where to place itself, and perhaps not choosing the side that the West may have expected. How significant do you think that realignment's going to be?
I think that what you call the global south, which is, of course, a very complicated network of very, very different countries, which contains, if you exclude the West and China, about 2/3 of the world, after all, is going to try, with very few exceptions, to avoid taking sides. They will most of the countries I know anything about, they will want to trade with both sides. They will want reasonable relations with both sides. Some of them will like many of the Asian countries will like an American presence in Asia as a balancing factor against China. There's no doubt about that. So they will be playing both sides in that sense, but they really won't want a war. They want to be allowed to trade. They want to be allowed to prosper. And they don't see why these emerging Cold War rivalry, whatever it is, should get in the way of that. And quite apart from that, they know, as Lord Blunkett said, that we have some very big global interests in common, including managing climate change, obviously managing the world economy so it doesn't actually break down completely. And so I think they're going to take the more nuanced position on all this.
Okay.
And I hope they succeed.
Well, perhaps there's a reason in there somewhere to be cheerful. Martin Wolf, Chief Economic Commentator at the Financial Times, Karen von Hippel, Director General of RUSI, and Lord Blunkett, Member of the House of Lords. Thank you all very much. Well, all that remains for me is really to say thank you, first of all, to all of my colleagues for coming up with fantastic guests and ideas day after day. They are the absolute unsung heroes of programmes like The World Tonight. I also want to thank all the studio managers who push buttons and ride faders. I'm looking at a couple of them just now, Graham and Jack. They make sure we stay on air. Thank you to you. Thanks also to Gillian, the real powerhouse of the office, and also all the other admin staff who support us. I'm not going to miss eating my dinner al desco, but I am going to miss the sense of camaraderie with all of you in Radioland in particular. It's a really huge privilege to do this job. For you to let me into your homes, your bedrooms and bathrooms. Yes, I've heard it all. We've travelled the world together and tried to make sense of what sometimes seem impossible and intractable situations and stories. Thank you very much for choosing to come with me and with The World Tonight. And finally, please keep supporting the BBC. It's far from perfect, but it is an important part of what makes this country very, very special. Hang on to it. So for now, from me, that really is The World Tonight for one last time. From everyone on the programme, good night.
And from everyone here in Continuity, Ritula, we salute you and we'll miss you. And what a pro, finished spot on time with able assistance from tonight's editor, Anna Korachinska, and studio director, Jack Graysmark.